Filming your own humiliation ritual as a documentary is crazy work. Well, the Stranger Things documentary is out and it just made everything 10 times worse than it already is, and that's saying something. Like, did Netflix release this documentary as a punishment for doing a bad job? This is the type of documentary you release after extremely positive reviews and critical acclaim as a way to stay humble and remind the audience that you're still human. It's insane that they got so much negative feedback from everywhere and still decided to release it. Phrasing it as 11 is going to off herself instead of 11 is going to sacrifice herself is heartbreaking. This being Millie's expression when she was asked about Elle's ending, she didn't even try to hide it. Look at the pain on this writer's face.
Like, if we're trying to sell it as she's gonna kill herself.
So when the Duffer Brothers said nobody has guessed the ending yet, it was because they didn't even know what the ending was themselves? This is actual rage bait, because genuinely, what were they doing in that studio? The Duffers seem like an absolute nightmare to work with. They wholeheartedly admitted that the script for the finale wasn't even done yet?
Do you have a script?
No. We don't.
And one last time, we're gonna go back to the Demogorgons in Dimension X because even the people in the writer's room were calling the Duffers out to ensure there weren't any plot holes. Love how they went, I agree at the beginning, then ended with a, and just scrapped everything. That guy said the most obvious thing in the whole show, and the Duffers just ignored him. In one part of the documentary, they're actually showing parts of the final script, and if you zoom in on the top portion of the tabs, you can see 3 different ChatGPT tabs open. Now, this is not definitive proof that they were using ChatGPT to help write the final script, but it's still pretty indicative and not a good look in general. Mind you, their budget for this season was $400 million. Wow, they didn't care about this season at all. How could they possibly ignore everyone in the cast, crew, and audience to give us the slop they did and the budget? Money laundering, surely. There's no other way. You know they've lost the plot if Maya Hawke has to remind the directors that Lucas and Max have no idea that Robin and Vicky are a lesbian couple, and therefore has to ask the director for permission to whisper a conversation about their relationship in front of those two.
That we've all been in together. No one knows that we're dating.
But you didn't please anybody. The jokes write themselves. Do you know how badly you have to screw up from writing the #1 rated episode of your entire show to that same season now being considered the lowest rated season of the whole series? We're breaking down the plot holes, inconsistencies, and the most expensive sloppy writing, and why the show only really worked up until Ross Duffer's divorce. Stick around to find out. The writing was clunky and terrible this time because why did Vecna kidnap Will Byers specifically? Stranger Things made it a point to emphasize how tethered Will Byers and Henry Creel are. In fact, they even posted an edit on their official page pointing out all the similarities in their storylines. So what was the meaning behind these parallels? How did Elle recognize Will in season 1? The Duffers have been trying to convince us that everything was planned from the beginning, but they failed to answer this. It was one of the only questions that everyone wanted answered, and they couldn't even do that. Why is the Upside Down stuck on the day Will went missing? How did Will communicate through the alphabet wall if time is stuck on the day Will went missing in the Upside Down and the alphabet wall was painted by Joyce after Will went missing? He wouldn't have been able to see the letters. How could Will see through the Demogorgon's eyes if they don't have eyes? Why did the Duffers tell us to have tissues ready? Not a single character died except Callie and maybe Elle. And if the Mind Flayer likes it cold, why is it native to a desert? Didn't they make it out so that when Will is close to the hive mind, he feels that pain? So why was he completely unfazed while they were torching the Mind Flayer? Why was there a Russian storyline if it was literally pointless? How did Max graduate when she was in a coma for a year and a half? Joyce and Hopper were friends with Henry Creel in 1959, yet they never acknowledged their friend is Vecna? What happened to Dr. K? What happened to all those pregnant women in the Upside Down? down? Where's Henry's scar from the gunshot wound he got as a child? Are we expected to know the entire plot of the stage play to understand vital plot points of the show? Speaking of which, the briefcase in the show, why did the writers change its contents from advanced military tech as seen in the play to a pulsating black stone? Lucas was brutally stabbed and injured in episode 4, but the next day he's carrying Max around like nothing's happened? Where's Argyle? Where's Dr. Owens? What happened to Murray? In early seasons, the Upside Down was depicted as having no liquid, yet somehow enough water is found to fill Eleven's tank? Will recalls visiting Melvald's general store for milkshakes, yet milkshakes are only shown sold there in the stage play over 25 years later. Why did the power lever at the Squawk radio station change color? How did Max go from blinded, limb snapped in multiple places, and brain dead to 100% normal? In season 4, Vecna tells Eleven that she had banished him to a new place, but from the stage play we know he visited there when he was 9 years old. Why did Vecna need exactly 12 kids? Why didn't Will control any of the Demogorgons, who supposedly originate from the Abyss, in the final battle against Vecna? Why didn't they try using the military sound emitters, aka El's kryptonite, against Vecna? They show us Will collapsed on the ground, writhing in pain at the end of the Sorcerer episode, but then when his mom chops Vecna's head off, he's unfazed? Be so for real. They wrote one of the most uncomfortable coming out scenes we've ever seen. In Noah's own words, it felt like a press conference or a play that he had to perform with 18 to 25 people, many of whom he's never interacted with even once in his life, while Will was on the verge of a panic attack. Like, what was Murray doing there? It just felt so impersonal. You know what else they trivialized? Will's feelings for Mike. Notice the difference in how Noah and the Duffers talk about Will's feelings. Noah makes it clear that Will loves Mike, while the Duffers wrote it off in one episode as a crush. Robin explicitly tells Will in episode 5 to find one person he can come out to and feel safe with, so to then have the show pivot into Will confessing his feelings for Mike and doing it to Mike's face in front of a room full of people and never once giving us Mike's perspective or reaction afterward was such an odd writing choice. Not to mention they had Will come out of fear. He was coerced into it by his abuser. That is not empowering writing. He tells us Vecna's been taunting him with his sexuality throughout visions we don't even see? And what was the point of Vecna tormenting him to come out if it was gonna go completely unutilized in the finale? Not once do we see Vecna actually trying to use this against Will, and aside from the mishandling of his whole emotional and personal arc, why did they introduce him as a superhero, a sorcerer, at the end of episode 4, only to sideline him in the next volume? Everyone is off doing their missions, and Will is at home crying, thinking that he's a villain? For what? And as if it couldn't get worse, Noah then has to go on record in an interview to clarify that he had to be the one to request the Duffers actually conclusively tie up the Will and Mike storyline in the finale, knowing that they left that relationship, in Noah's own words, ambiguous for all 5 seasons. The Duffers do write a scene, but instead of respectfully closing out that arc as Noah had said, they make a jab at the fans through that "friends? No thanks, best friends" line that was clearly mocking the fans. All because a group of majority queer fans, a group of people who have been historically marginalized, wanted to see the main gay character on the show get his happy ending after 5 seasons of emotional and physical abuse. The same show in which, in season 1, Mike pushes Troy to the ground for making a homophobic comment about Will. The show drew in a group of outcasts because of scenes like this, and now they wonder why queer fans are so devastated over their ending? His suffering and pining may have taken place on screen, but his joy and future romance are disappointingly left to the imagination. After seeing how they handled Robin, Vicky, and Will in season 5, we never want to hear Stranger Things claim to be a show for outcasts ever again, because it's just really a show made to profit off of outcasts while upholding conformity. They brought back Callie, a POC character who was already hated in the fandom, not to redeem her, not to make people like her, but to actually make her even more unlikable and then off her in the end. So the costume designer says she doesn't know the ending for Kali, but assumes it should be powerful, only for the Duffers to say she gets shot. And she's just like, oh, okay. It had the potential to be such a great storyline, with sisters teaming up to defeat Vecna together. All the bickering between Kali and Hopper was also just not necessary. With media, even if it's fictional, you're sending a message to your audience. It has repercussions and consequences. The message that the audience is receiving from what was done to Elle is she's been abused and tortured and experimented on, manipulated, used her entire life, and the only way to save everyone else except for herself was to die? It's baffling how they decided to conclude her story that way. They gave her this arc of discovering what she likes to eat, what she likes to wear, who she is outside of her relationships with men, only for them to reduce her to a symbol of the magic of childhood that has to go away in order for the rest of the boys to move on with their lives. They never saw her as anything more than just a concept. They depict it like Eleven is reclaiming her bodily autonomy by deciding that the only way to break the cycle of abuse is by offing herself. In fact, the Duffers called it inevitable. That is atrocious messaging. This show has repeatedly shown that if you're too damaged, you should just not exist. They did this with Billy, Chrissy, Patrick, Eddie, and Kali. When this happens over and over, it shows how they actually feel about people who've been systematically abused or neglected. The concept of having to off yourself to end the cycle of abuse being inevitable in the Duffers' eyes because that was the only way to break free from her trauma is a horrific message to send, and also extremely dangerous. The Duffers didn't even let her hear Mike's "I love you" back before she died. What was the point of Hopper's speech if they weren't going to stick by that? This is probably the worst storyline they have ever written. She deserved so much better. Joyce's character got completely sidelined. Winona looked so over it during her 0.5 seconds of screen time in the documentary. From being the main showrunner in season 1, in season 5 we just saw the same scene of Joyce comforting Will over 300 times, and in a show where your cast is so large and you've diluted the storyline, we just don't have the time for redundancy. Mike's character fell flat. He didn't crash out. He had no emotional breakthrough. His mom almost dies. His dad almost dies. His sister gets kidnapped. His other sister is fighting for her life in the Upside Down. His girlfriend or ex-girlfriend is also in the Upside Down fighting for her life and being hunted by the military. And his best friend is in a coma. And yet, Mike stays unfazed. He comes up with plans, and that's great, but where is the heart? He's supposed to be the heart. And what do you mean Mike Wheeler built the bomb that offed 11? Finn Wolfhard has actually addressed this a few times in interviews. He disagreed with the direction of his character, but was ignored. Do the Duffers have personal beef with Finn or something? Is it because he once said he was a better director than the Duffers? And in the end, every other character finds happiness except for Mike Wheeler's because he's stuck in his PTSD, and instead of going to therapy and working through that, he's sitting in his dorm room writing fantasy fiction to avoid reality. They also rewrote the narrative like Hopper was in the wrong for the way he raised 11, also suggesting that he doesn't know his daughter better than Callie because Callie is technically her sister in the lab. Why? Lucas didn't have much development either as a character outside of his relationship with Max, the way that Max had her own solo storyline with Holly and protecting her in Vecna's mind, while also having her relationship with Lucas. They never gave him his own independent arc. Also, did they just forget about Robin and Vicky? Weren't they supposed to have an Enzo's date? They explicitly resolved Jonathan and Nancy, Joyce and Hopper, Lucas and Max in the epilogue, and when the Duffers were called out by an interviewer for breaking up Robin and Vicky, the only gay couple on the show, the Duffers responded that Lucas and Max's relationship is just quote-unquote too pure, and Robin and Vicky are just a high school romance that probably didn't make it, thus trivializing their entire relationship. The final battle was super anticlimactic. 10 years of build-up just for them to off Vecna in 5 minutes? That's not even the plot hole. The plot hole is that there were no demogorgons, no demobats, no demo dogs. Some people think it's because the demogorgons are in the Upside Down. No, that's not true. The Upside Down is just a bridge. It was created the moment that Eleven made psychic contact with that demogorgon in episode 1, which means that the demogorgons are actually native to wherever that bridge leads to, and that is the Abyss. In fact, if you go back to season 4 and you watch Henry Creel discover this land for the first time, there's a demogorgon right there. Dimension X/the Abyss is their home base. Which brings us to our next point. What is the difference between Dimension X and the Abyss? A few weeks ago, one of the producers, Sean Levy, was asked about this, and he said he didn't think they were the same thing, only for the Duffer Brothers to respond, yes, they are. If the producers and the writers aren't even clear about what they're writing, how are we supposed to be as fans? Mind you, the general audience doesn't even know what Dimension X is because you have to actually watch the Stranger Things play in New York to understand it. This is not serious writing. The Duffers are now saying this scene where Mike and Elle share a heartbreaking goodbye in the void never happened because apparently Eleven could not have used her powers to bring Mike into the void, so this was entirely hallucinated. They say that they are debunking the idea that Eleven ever communicated with Mike in the end, that she ever said goodbye, but then they want to say that Eleven's ending is ambiguous, and then going into interviews and confirming that nothing would make sense about the finale if she actually survived, thus failing to execute said ambiguity. The only reason they're saying this is because they're trying to mitigate the amount of hate they knew they would get for having a 17-year-old victim off herself as their series finale. That is it. They are doing damage control. They are also now saying that Henry Creel may have not been manipulated by the Mind Flayer and that it's up to audience interpretation. That is canonically untrue because the Stranger Things play, which was written by the same writers working on Stranger Things 5, is entirely about the Mind Flayer controlling Henry Creel. The production makes that point impossible to miss. A massive Mind Flayer towers over the stage, and the story explicitly shows it entering Henry and warping him as a child, the same way Will was possessed in season 2. That is how Henry turns evil. It is not ambiguous in the play. The play also confirms that Henry went missing at age 12 in an alternate dimension called Dimension X, later referred to as the Abyss in season 5. His powers come from prolonged exposure to that environment. The atmosphere alters him physically, even changing his blood, which is why the season 5 narrative that Henry simply opened a suitcase and absorbed power from a mysterious rock makes no sense within the show's own canon. Did they forget the plot of their own play? And the Duffers cannot claim ignorance here. There is behind the scenes footage of them actively working on the play alongside Kate Treffry, one of the core writers of Stranger Things. This isn't a continuity slip. It genuinely feels like we've been pranked. In fact, there's a popular petition online going viral in the fandom with over 370,000 signatures of people claiming that there's a whole part of season 5 that wasn't released, to the extent that the Duffer Brothers had to actually shut it down in a Variety magazine interview. There was another popular theory out there that the Stranger Things finale was a fake out, and it's a callback to season 1 when all the boys are telling Mike in the basement that his campaign made no sense and was way too short, because that is how lost people are. They don't even want to believe the finale was the finale. When asked why there were no Demogorgons in the finale, they're now saying it's because Vecna was not expecting it. Yep, Vecna was not expecting a sneak attack on his home turf. He could never have imagined that. They're there somewhere. Isn't Vecna omniscient? Isn't the whole point that he can see into people's minds? It also contradicts the concept of the hive mind. When one thing is attacked, everything else in the hive mind should know it. In fact, in season 4, they showed us a demo bat spying upon the boys and the Upside Down and alerting Vecna. In season 2, when Joyce burns the Mind Flayer out of Will, it simply reinvents itself and finds a new host because it's just particle matter. It's eternal. But the Duffers now say that the Mind Flayer died when Vecna was decapitated, and in the play that sets up Stranger Things 5, they say that the Mind Flayer is inside of Henry Creel, that the Mind Flayer is a shadow and it possessed Henry. But if it's a bunch of particles, then how would it die by decapitation? We also don't know how the Mind Flayer went from this to this, because it quote-unquote happened off-screen. However, it almost feels like the Duffers purposely made it manifest into a physical form to make it easier to off and wrap up the mythology. They've also now confirmed that Vecna did open Will Byers' door through psionic abilities, because the Demogorgons sure couldn't. They don't have telekinetic abilities, but it happened off-screen. At this point, it feels like they have to be rage-baiting us. They explicitly said in a sit-down interview a few weeks ago that they were actually going to show who unlocked Will Byers' door in the finale. Guess not. Doesn't this also contradict the idea that Vecna only took Will because, quote-unquote, he was a weak kid who was easy to kidnap? Though that's not surprising, because the Duffers also said in a previous interview that Will was not at the wrong place at the wrong time, and their play actually ends with Vecna telling Joyce that he's going to take her son, meaning there was a specific reason. Guess that also happened off-screen too? The Duffers also went on record to admit that their knowledge of D&D is embarrassingly low, because it wasn't supposed to be a big part of the show. D&D, the game that consistently foreshadows all of the supernatural plots in Stranger Things, the game where they get their villains from. The more these guys try to explain what happened off screen or try to explain things that didn't make sense, the worse they're making this for themselves. And mind you, they have a spin-off coming out. The Duffers have also tweeted that they regret doing any post-finale interviews and that they were quote-unquote recovering from the flu, which is why nothing they're saying is making any sense right now. This just goes to show that the Duffers did not actually have everything planned from the beginning. Why are they so hell-bent on proving to everyone that they did instead of just admitting it? The classic example is Eleven's ending. At first, the Duffers said that they knew the whole time that Eleven would not be with the boys at the end because she had to, quote-unquote, go away in order for the boys to move on with their lives, whatever that means. Then they say they actually didn't know for sure, and they had serious discussions in the writer's room over whether Eleven could have a happy ending in the end. Mind you, at the end of season 4, Millie Bobby Brown said that Eleven's whole arc was about discovering who she is outside of her relationships with men. The Duffers also said that they left Eleven's ending ambiguous and open to fan interpretation because they felt that that was the most satisfying ending to her character for the fans. Satisfying for who? And then they said in a subsequent interview that they were shutting out fan noise when deciding how the character arcs were gonna end, and then they contradicted themselves again by saying Eleven does have an objective ending. We just don't know about it. But only Millie knows about it. Millie Bobby Brown, who reacted like this when she was asked in one of her final interviews for Stranger Things if she was happy with Eleven's ending. They say in one interview that Robin and Vicky may have ended up together and that they're leaving that also up to fan interpretation, but then in another they say no, it's actually heavily implied they broke up. They debunked the idea that Vecna was behind Will's kidnapping back in November, but now they're saying it was Vecna, he was just acting through a Demogorgon. With every interview the Duffers are doing, they're making it more and more clear that even they don't know what's going on. Because what do you mean my best guess is the military disbanded when Eleven left? You guess? This is your own show! The irony is that the more they try to make things make sense, the worse they look. And honestly, it's kind of entertaining and sad. And the Duffers are probably out there somewhere right now thinking the fans are just bitter that we didn't cater to what they wanted. No! The fans are bitter because these guys lost track of what made their show so special. They grew the cast so big that they diluted the show and then took time away from the characters whose storylines people were actually invested in. They spent all that time on those kids at the Creel house. It could have just ended with Vecna and Holly and their storyline to bring the show full circle and re-explore why Will was taken. They made the central theme of their show, love is more powerful than fear, even stated that in the play that was meant to set up season 5, only to break up almost every fan favorite couple in the penultimate episode and then do it in such a confusing way that they had to clarify that's what they were doing in an interview. They lost touch with their fan base, massacred almost every single storyline, and fumbled the ball badly. Imagine spending 10 years writing 5 seasons of a show, with 3 of those years dedicated to just your final season, which is only 8 episodes, and it was so bad your fandom went viral for thinking that they were being Vecna'd. With hashtag conformitygate, fans convinced themselves that the Duffers were breaking the fourth wall because it was the only way to explain all of the inconsistencies, plot holes, and mistakes. The reason that there was mass psychosis in the Stranger Things fandom following the finale is because this is the show that set the precedent early on that every single detail matters, that there are no coincidences, that we should look into things. So now people would rather delude themselves into believing that the Duffers are going to suddenly explain all of the plot holes in a brand new episode because they can't accept the fact that season 5 was simply sloppy. We gave these guys way too much credit with hashtag conformitygate. This and the lack of an episode 8 script confirms Leigh Janiak, Ross Duffer's ex-wife, is definitely the person who was ghostwriting, or at least offering ideas and support to her husband throughout seasons 1 through 4, because ultimately one of her goals with Fear Street was to give screen time and tell stories of marginalized people. The fact that you have a queer character like Robin and you're not even able to effectively remember that she isn't out? One of the lines in the season is that she hopes to double the number of people she comes out to. She's out to like 3 people. The Duffer brothers clearly do not know what to do with this character that they allegedly created. It all clearly reeks of hashtag divorcegate. Part of the problem of season 5 is that Ross Duffer got a divorce. Her name is Leigh Janiak. She is also the director and screenwriter of Fear Street, and for the record, this is good writing. She was able in seasons 1 through 4 to help write the show, and if you're looking for where this fell off, there might be many reasons, but this is likely the cornerstone reason. She was the brains behind the operation. We've been watching this show for 10 years, and there's no denying that something felt missing this time. No foreshadowing and irony, nothing that came back into play later. It does lend credibility to the conspiracy theory that Ross Duffer may have been bouncing ideas off of his wife throughout the years, and that she might be the missing piece in season 5 that's caused a bit of a decline in the show. Inspired by this new information, we thought we would just outline a few brief ways that we think Stranger Things and Fear Street have commonalities. One of the most glaringly obvious comparisons is the talent. We have stars like Sadie Sink and Maya Hawke who are in both Stranger Things and Fear Street. And then the next obvious comparison is going to be the nostalgia. Stranger Things capitalized on nostalgia by having the show set in the 80s. Likewise, Fear Street is set in the 80s and then in the 90s, and that nostalgic feeling really rings throughout the show. The setting is very similar for both. Fear Street takes place in Shadyside, which is in Ohio, and Stranger Things occurs in Hawkins, Indiana. Both of these locations give a small town feel to the show and the movie. They're in a similar genre with similar themes. You've got supernatural phenomena, and both are paying homage to classic scary movies. Fear Street is inspired by Scream and Friday the 13th, while Stranger Things is inspired by Alien and Nightmare on Elm Street. The location as well is the same. Both Stranger Things and Fear Street are shot in Atlanta, Georgia, and some of the scenes are even set in the same place. We've got the Hawkins Post, which in Fear Street is actually the police station. And again, the most important and crucial piece of information is the production. While Leigh was never given credit on Stranger Things, it's very logical to assume that based on the mood, tone, and overall similarities between the two, she was an intricate part of the show. Every actor and crew member knows this. She both directed and wrote for the first 3 Fear Street movies, and if you care to do a deep dive on the 4th one, you'll note how she was left out of that and how the film ultimately suffered. So what do you think? Was she quietly shaping the heart of Stranger Things in seasons 1 through 4? Was Ross Duffer so devastated by his divorce he completely ruined a show about love overcoming fear by writing a tragedy? Drop your thoughts below.